Okay, yeah, now we can hear.
Good. Good afternoon and welcome to Saskatchewan Canscape's presentation of Paula Jane Remlinger talking about rhyme crimes, what makes good children's poetry. Saskatchewan Canscape is the Saskatchewan chapter of Canscape, which is the Canadian Society of Children's Authors, Illustrators, and Performers. I'm Sharon Hamilton and I'm the president of the local chapter. We're very pleased to present this with the sponsorship of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild through their writing group grants. Welcome to everyone who's here, and welcome to everyone that's watching this on live stream. I'll just tell you a little bit about Paula Jane. Paula Jane lives on an acreage in Beaver Creek, which is just south of Saskatoon, with her husband and her black cat named Dickens, which is appropriate for a writer. She had her first publication at the age of 13. She has a Bachelor of English, a Master's of English, Bachelor of Education, certificates in teaching ESL and adult education. She recently completed a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing through UBC. Paula Jane has worked as a bookseller, an editorial assistant, and educational liaison at Thistledown Press, a teaching assistant and writing center tutor at the University of Saskatchewan, and she was the executive director of the Sage Hill Writing Experience. She currently does freelance writing and editing. Her poetry has been published in Grain, The New Quarterly, Room, and is forthcoming in CB2. She has recently published a poem called James Bond Considers Retirement in an anthology called I Found It at the Movies, an anthology of film poems in 2014. She also participated in the CBC Radio Regional Poetry Face-Off with a poem called Love, Pathos, and Electronics. So I will give you Paula Jane.
You don't need that microphone.
You don't need this
Yeah,
one?
you don't.
Oh, okay. Well, all of this technology stuff is new to me. This is my first webcast, so thank you very much for having me here. And thank you to both the Saskatchewan Writers Guild and to Canscape for sponsoring this. I really appreciate that. So again, it's Rhyme Crimes, what makes good children's poetry? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one particular poem, which you can find on the Saskatchewan Writers Guild website under events, under this talk. You can find a copy of the poem. And the poem is Fancy Dive by Shel Silverstein. And I'm going to use that poem to sort of focus what I'm saying. And I have 8 points that I'm going to cover, and I'll summarize those at the end. So, first thing to do to start with is, let's read the poem. Fancy Dive. The fanciest dive that ever was dove was done by Melissa of Coconut Grove. She bounced on the board and flew into the air with a twist of her head and a twirl of her hair. She did 34 jackknives, backflipped and spun, quadruple gainered and reached for the sun, and then somersaulted 9 times and a quarter, and looked down and saw that the pool had no water. So this is one of the poems from A Light in the Attic, which is one of Shel Silverstein's key collections. And I've actually had this one since I was a kid. This was one of my favorite poems. And I liked it just because it's a fun poem and it has that great surprise ending where there's no water in the pool. As I have studied poetry more and more in my life, I started looking at this poem a little differently and seeing how good a poem it is. There's only 8 lines there. It's fairly simple in terms of its rhymes, but it's a fantastically complex poem in a lot of ways. So, of the 8 things to remember, the first one I'd say is show and tell. You'll hear a lot of times as a writer, show, don't tell. And I think with kids' poetry, you have to have a balance. Kids don't do well with abstract ideas. So you may need a combination of telling and showing to get the idea across. You certainly want to have strong visuals. You want to have language that evokes the senses and engages the ear and the mind and the tongue, all of that. So you need strong visuals, and that comes in your language choices. So in this poem, you get strong visuals from she bounced on the board and flew into the air with a twist of her head and twirl of her hair. You can see all of those things happening. If you used different verbs, you would have a different picture entirely. So the verbs are the main part here. They're really what gives you the meat of the poem. You can also activate the senses with how carefully you choose your language. We have Melissa of Coconut Grove. So where is she from? Coconut Grove. We don't know if that's in Saskatchewan or Florida or California. It probably is in somewhere warm and sunny, makes you think of palm trees and tropical weather. Maybe you get a hint of that smell of coconut in the suntan lotion. So by bringing in a word like that, he's setting a scene without actually spelling out all those details. You've got that feeling of blue skies, warm weather, and he hasn't said anything about it. So you can imply ideas without spelling them out, but specificity is important. You'll notice that it's not just a girl, it's Melissa who did this, and she's from Coconut Grove. So lots of times kids will relate to the person in the poem. They'll usually assume it's a kid in the poem that's being talked about, so you want to have your poem relatable. You want it to be a kid-friendly person in the poem. And sometimes in poetry, especially adult poetry, we concentrate more on the abstract. With kids, you really want to make sure that the idea comes across clearly. You want to use clear language, simple language, strong verbs, but interesting language too. And if you have questions as I go along, just stop me. So that's the first thing, showing and telling. The second thing is you need good rhymes and interesting sounds in the poem. All poetry is meant to be read. It's meant to be heard aloud. It's meant for kids to read. It's meant for people to read to kids. So you've got to have in mind how it's going to sound, how it's going to feel being read. You've got to concentrate on that. Good rhymes don't have to be complex rhymes. In this poem, we've got dove and grove, air and hair, spun and sun, and then that last one, quarter and water, which is a half rhyme or a slant rhyme. So they don't quite sound alike, and there's a very good reason that he did that, which we'll talk about. You can also have sounds within the poem that are repeated. Alliteration, to use a literary term, is when the first sound of a word is repeated. So we have the fanciest dive that ever was dove, was done by Melissa. So you've got the repeated D. The twist and twirl in the poem, you have that repeated sound. But you've also got internal repeated sounds like jackknives. That picks up on dive earlier in the poem. And nine, so you have those long I's. So usually you're working with a family group of sounds in a poem, and if you keep those sort of in your keywords, it helps to both establish rhythm in the poem, which we'll talk more about, and to train the ear into a strong rhythm and a good picture for the mind. You have to really rely on your ear as a children's poet. Read everything out loud, and you have to be careful when reading aloud too, because we can fit just about anything into the rhythm of language. So read lots of poetry. Read good poetry, like Shel Silverstein. Sheree Fitch is a fantastic poet. Lois Simi had some great poetry books from Saskatchewan. There's a lot of American poets. Jack Poletsky has a book called A Pizza the Size of the Sun. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Also rhymed picture books. They're not as common now as they used to be, and I think some of that is they're just so hard to write. If you think children's poetry is simple, it looks simple on the surface, it looks effortless when it's done well, but it's really one of the hardest things to get right. Just looking at the language here for a second, the first two lines here I would say are very formal language. The fanciest dive that ever was dove was done by Melissa of Coconut Grove. So you have the was dove, was done. These are passive kinds of constructions. We would say it would be better in an action kind of a voice. Usually, Melissa dove this fancy dive. But that doesn't work here. Why did he choose to use a formal voice here? Well, to me it sounds like something you'd read in a record book. You know, the fanciest dive that ever was dove, or a TV announcer, or someone that gives it a little bit of formality to it, some authority speaking. Then when you get into the poem and you're seeing what happens, you go back to straightforward language. Bounced on the board, flew into the air, and then the technical language. 34 jackknives. It doesn't really matter if a kid knows what a jackknife is. They'll get the idea. Quadruple gainered. I'm sure I still don't know what a quadruple gainer is, but it doesn't matter. It sounds magnificently impressive. And that's what comes across here. 34 helps because it's a giant number, and you think the space she has from the board to the water, she must have flown spectacularly into the air. So you've got a visual there that's absurd and impossible and wonderful for kids. And so you go from that formal to the more engaging language, and there's a reason for that. I would say that poets have to be very conscientious about every word you put on the page. And if you are choosing to write in a particular style, whether it's formal or informal, you should know why you're doing it. Someone's not necessarily going to sit down and analyze everything you're doing, but you should know why you're doing it. I've seen some more modern children's poetry books where they rely on things like the font, changing the font of the poem to put words in capitals, to make them bigger, to make surprise, to put exclamation marks. And that's kind of a cheat. If you have to change the font to get the idea across, you're not working hard enough. So you want to be sure you're using the language rather than playing with the typography of it. So that's show and tell, good rhymes. Number 3 is flawless rhythm. And that is probably the absolutely hardest thing to do. The English language has a natural rhythm to it of accented and unaccented syllables. And so most of us are used to reading or picking out a rhythm that is da-dum, 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 da-dum. We can all do that. If you're having trouble when you're trying to see what the rhythm is in a poem, there's a very simple way that you can do that. And it's just by putting your hand under your chin as you read. And on every accented syllable, your chin is going to drop a little bit. And that tells you where your accents are. You can also do it by clapping. I've always done it with my chin for some reason. So the fanciest dive that ever was dove, and I'm exaggerating a little, was done by Melissa of Coconut Grove. So we've got a 4-place rhythm there. She bounced on the board and flew into the air with a twist of her head and a twirl of her hair. She did 34 jackknives, backflipped and spun, quadruple gainered and reached for the sun, and then somersaulted 9 times and a quarter, and looked down and saw that the pool had no water. So we've got a consistent 4 beats for every line. Now, the thing with rhythm is it doesn't have to be consistent all the way through the poem, but you have to know if you're going to change it. Again, what's the reason you're changing it for? Why are you doing that? If you're doing it, if you want 2 extra long lines in the middle to draw something out perhaps, that would be a reason. If you need to speed up the action in the middle of the poem, you might put shorter lines in, make the rhythm shorter. So always have in the back of your mind, why am I doing this? What is it doing for the poem? How is it helping the poem? How does it convey what I'm trying to get across? The worst thing you can do is to force words into the rhythm. And I was thinking about if I could find an example from this, and I was thinking back to when I was a kid and writing. I remember I wrote one poem, tragic poem called Alone. And do you ever find yourself alone without a friend, depending on yourself and no one else to the bitter end? So you can cram a lot of words in there and still make it fit the rhythm. But the good test of that, a good test of that is to see, can someone else read the poem and read it naturally in the rhythm without having to force things? So get someone else to read your poems, someone with a good ear, someone who will be honest, and listen to them read it. If they read it significantly differently than you do, or if they stumble over parts of it, you need to go back and look and see what's happening in that section of the poem. And we don't all read exactly the same, but in a good poem, whether you say she bounced on the board and flew into the air, or you say she bounced on the board and flew into the air, it doesn't fundamentally change the rhythm of the line. So I think that makes a good poet, when you can work with variables in people's speech patterns without it really damaging the poem. If it makes a huge difference, you've got to go back to the poem. You can also use, with the rhythm, keep in mind internal rhythms and internal rhymes. I think one of the best examples is Robert Service's poem Sam McGee. There are strange things done under the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that'll make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was the night on the marge of Lake Labarge I cremated Sam McGee. And the reason we can remember it is because the rhymes and the rhythm are consistent, consistently perfect. So that's what you're aiming for as a poet, if you want to be memorable. You can have all kinds of different poems. I don't remember a lot of the poems in Shel Silverstein's book, but I remember enough of them that I know there's really good rhythms in his work. The things that you want to repeat or tell somebody else, or the ones that play over in your mind again, those are the ones to look at as good examples. So that's the rhythm. Fourth thing would be the element of play. You have to have some play in your work, a sense of the absurd or the ridiculous. Have fun while you're writing. I remember working on a story at one point, and I was thinking, oh, I can't wait till I get to the good part. And that's not good, because if I'm waiting to get to the good part, the reader is thinking the same thing. I hope this gets better. And they are not going to stick it out, especially in poetry where it's short. So you've got to get in there and capture their interest right away. You've got to have good first lines. If you look through a book like this, the first lines are often what sets up the poem. There's a polar bear in our frigid air. The Frisbee, he got tired of sailing. A mountain climbing exploration. Channel 1's no fun. So every one of them sort of has something to get you into it right away. You know what the topic is going to be. Sometimes when you're writing the poem, though, you have to write your way into a poem. That's how I find I am. So I tend to write 5 or 6 verses that are going to be cut when I get to the good stuff. And for me, it's all of that writerly stuff about setting the situation, putting the setting, making sure the characters know, making sure the person who reads it is going to understand exactly what I want them to get out of the poem. And then you realize you don't need to tell them all that. You just need to give them the poem and let them figure it out. That sense of absurdity, things like Dr. Seuss, Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear, who had the gingham dog and the calico cat, which is an old rhyme. But Alligator Pie by Dennis Lee. Alligator pie, if I don't get some, I think I'm gonna die. Very simple, but memorable. Because who's had alligator pie? Or alligator soup, or any of the rest of that. Sheree Fitch has one book called Toes in My Nose. I put toes in my nose and I can't get them out. Well, that's a situation then. You've got a scenario to work with. And you can see all the possibilities of how that might go. And kids love absurdity. They have no trouble seeing what is impossible. They are not going to question that someone can do 34 jackknives, backflips, quadruple gained, and then somersaulted 9 times and a quarter. So they're not going to question that. It's having fun. So you need to, when you're writing, of course, be prepared to change things and change them again and change them again and change them again as many times as it takes to get the poem to the point where it feels effortless. And that's what you're really aiming for, someone to say, oh, it looks so simple. And it's really not. Always keep the audience in mind when you're writing. Age level, because you can write poetry for very young children, so you'll need to have usually shorter line lengths, shorter words, a more limited vocabulary, or sort of the main group of probably 5 to about 9-year-olds is what these books were meant for. That's a fun age group, and even older kids love reading them too, because you can have a lot of fun. And you can put in those fantastic words like quadruple gained. Kids love new words. So don't be afraid to put in words that you think, well, they might not understand that, but they'll get it in the context. Like I said, I'm not sure what quadruple gained is, but you can figure it out. Okay? So always keeping the audience in mind, the age level, your word choice is part of that, and whether it's something the child will probably be reading or something that will be read to them. The 5th thing would be the element of surprise. Now this poem does it exceptionally well. You want to do the unexpected. You've got the setup in this poem, the fanciest dive that ever was dove. So we're going to hear about this magnificent thing. And then we're shown it. She bounced on the board, all of the magnificent things she does. And then somersaulted 9 times and a quarter, and there's a punctuation mark there to slow us down, and looked down and saw that the pool had no water. And there's your punchline. So if you're using humor, which you absolutely should in children's poetry, you want your punchline to be at the end, where it's gonna have the most effect. I love the fact that water is absolutely the last word in the poem. And quarter and water, we talked about that being a half rhyme or a slant rhyme. Quarter gives nothing away when you get there. And then somersaulted 9 times and a quarter. Well, my brain has been set up to anticipate that every two lines are going to rhyme. So I'm looking in my brain for something that rhymes with quarter. So I'm not thinking about water, because that's not an exact rhyme at all. So when the end finally does come at the end of that long sentence, where we're looking down and seeing the pool, there's the no water. So I love the fact that he tricks us in a way into, don't look over there, don't think about that water, not until the very end, and then there's none of it there. So you really want to put good punchlines if you're using humor. You want your surprise at the end. You want to do something unexpected. You can still write about a cat and a hat, but you can only do it if you can do something different with it. So this is a very short poem called The Lost Cat. We can't find the cat. We don't know where she's at. Oh, where did she go? Does anyone know? Let's ask this walking hat. And there's the illustration with the little cat feet underneath. So you can still write poems about cats and hats and very simple rhymes, but you've got to do something different with it. You've got to do something more interesting, something that's going to make kids laugh at the end of it. Kids' laughter is one of the best sounds in the world, and you want that. You want them to laugh. So that's surprise. And we talked a little bit about like the 34 jackknives, that kind of thing too, the absolutely absurd. Feel free to exaggerate. This is the place you can exaggerate. Number 6, no matter what you do, write good poetry. It still has to be good poetry. And I would say if you're writing for kids, it has to be even better poetry. Because adults will give you the benefit of the doubt on some things. Kids, not necessarily. So it has to be good poetry, whether it's rhymed or not rhymed, and you can write non-rhyming poetry for children. There are markets for that and places for that, but it still has to be the best poetry you can. One definition of poetry is the best words in the best order. So you're always looking for the strongest possible words to use, those action verbs, those really interesting words. You want to keep in mind the age level that you're looking at again. But if you haven't read poetry recently and you want to write it, you need to start by reading it. So read lots of kids' poetry, read every rhymed picture book you can find, and you'll start to see, well, this one is good. This one I had to really work to make the rhythm work. This one's not as good. The more you read it, the better you'll get at hearing, because you're training your ear when you read them. You'll hear the difference between them. Books of kids' poetry, there's also ones for older kids now. There's a trend of writing novels in poetry. So there was a book that won the Governor General's Award, Crazy Man by Pamela Porter. Wonderful book, good, strong poetry in it. A Handful of Dust is another book, good poetry. It's a first-person narrative. So it's this girl's experience told through first-person narrative poems. Jacqueline Woodson, who's an American, was just named the Young People's Poet Laureate in the US. I haven't read her work, but I'm going to and see what she's doing. She's doing a lot of first-person narratives too. So as a poet, you also need to move out of just children's work. If you haven't read contemporary poetry recently, if you haven't seen what's being published, take a look at it, see what's out there. Look at a journal, look at a poetry anthology, look at something that's been done in the last 10 years, 5 years, right now, and see what kinds of things are being published, because poetry changes. And it's still good, even if you're looking at adult poetry, it still gives you a sense of how does someone shape a line, especially if you're looking at writing non-rhymed poetry. How does someone still incorporate language and sound? How does someone break a line in a place to give different levels of meaning? How do they take an image or a metaphor or simile, those things that are maybe more complex and abstract? How can you take what you've seen there and apply it to your work with kids? You probably don't use a lot of metaphor with kids because it's a little too abstract, but simile, which is with the use of like or as, pizza the size of the sun is kind of a simile, that kind of thing. So read contemporary poetry. There are also magazines like Cricket, Chickadee, Spider, all in that family of kids magazines that still publish poems. I know Diane Young, who's a poet from Saskatoon, recently had a beautiful poem published in there, a 2-page spread about Old MacDonald and his farm, and it's very playful, and it's got beautiful illustrations with it. So there are markets for these things. There still are markets. Okay, number 7, treat your audience with respect. Kids are smart. They are very smart, more than we give them credit for most of the time. So never talk down to kids. They will know if you're doing it, and they won't like it, and they will respond accordingly. You have to, if you can, go back to that place in your mind where you were a kid. Try and remember what it was like. What did it feel like when something happened? What did you think about when you were a kid? Did you want to go into space? Did you think the library should be on wheels? Did you think spiders should roller skate? What did you think? Think of all those absurd things when you were a kid. What did you like to draw? What did you like to play with? Sometimes even if you physically get down on the floor and see what the perspective is like from a kid's point of view, because we're all so tall now, it's really different when you're down on the floor and you're a kid. You can't see stuff in the same way. So change your point of view, change how you look at things. You don't really want to try to teach kids in poetry. We want to pass on our wisdom to them. We want to pass on our knowledge. This isn't the place to do it. This is the place to have fun. And kids don't need to understand everything in a poem. Dr. Seuss, we didn't know what wuzzles and weasels and all those things were, but we didn't need to, because in the context you can figure it out. Lewis Carroll wrote Jabberwocky, and you have beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the Frumia's Bandersnatch. We don't know what any of those things are, but we know there are claws and teeth, and we should shun them, and these are all dangerous monsters of some kind. And that's enough for a kid. You can describe them more if you're doing a whole poem about that, but really, they'll figure it out. So you've got to trust them. If you try it out on kids and they don't get it, it's not that they don't get it. It's you as a writer have to go back and look at what it is in there that's not making sense to them. Kids are a great audience for you because they will tell you, usually bluntly, that it doesn't make sense or they don't like something. So don't be afraid to try it out on kids. I don't have kids of my own, so I borrow other people's children. Usually you can do that. So just to follow on from that, treating your audiences with respect, number 8 is avoid what I call teacher syndrome. And I've been an English teacher, and English teaching is a very hard job, but we sometimes as poets think, but I want them to get a message out of this. What would be the message of this poem? What would be the theme of the poem?
Look before you jump.
Right. Basically, look before you jump. Look before you leap. There's a nice little phrase. We can encapsulate the poem. But why do we want to? What does it serve? It doesn't do anything at this point. We'll save that for when they're older and they're going to university and we haven't destroyed their love of poems. So this stuff is supposed to be fun. They don't need to worry about the lessons in it, and you don't need to worry about the lessons in it. Billy Collins, who was the US Poet Laureate, had a fantastic poem that I don't have memorized, but he basically talks about how poetry can do so many things. It engages the senses, it gives you strong visuals, it does all of these wonderful things. And all students want to do is tie the poem to a chair and beat the truth out of it. Because that's how we've set up poetry now in higher levels of education, that we analyze, we interpret, and often we give children the mistaken impression that there's only one right answer for these things. So you don't want to do that, especially when they're young and you're working with young kids. It should all be about making it fun in the brain, in the mouth, in the ear. It's like candy. Poetry should be like candy. It should just be for fun. So there doesn't have to be a theme or a message, and that goes back to the element of absurdity, asking what if. So just to summarize, that's basically the 8 points I wanted to do. So number 1 is show and tell. You need a balance there to engage the mind. Rhyme. You need good, strong rhymes that engage the ear and the tongue. You need to have a flawless sense of rhythm. You can use the method of putting your hand under your chin to help you, or you can clap them out to help find that rhythm. And then be consistent in your rhythms, or if you vary it, know why you're doing it. Number 4, play. You've got to play, you've got to have fun while you're doing it, or there's no point doing it, and kids will know if you're not having fun. Number 5 is have that element of surprise. If you're going to make a joke at the end, or you've got a punchline, don't telegraph it. Let them find it out at the end. Don't do what's expected. Number 6, if you're writing poetry, always write the best poem you can. Whether it's writing for kids or writing for adults, it's got to be good poetry. Number 7, respect the audience. Remember, kids are smart, smarter than us, and they will know if you're trying to get something past them. And number 8, avoid teacher syndrome. There's no need to send a message in these, just have fun. So I thought I would just end off with a poem I wrote when I was a kid, actually, but still works really well, I think, as a children's poem, because it has pretty good rhythm, and it has a lot of those elements of what do you think about when you're a kid, what do you relate to. I happened to go to an all-girls school, and every school fall we had to get new shoes, and they had to be black black shoes, we couldn't wear runners, things like that. So this poem's called New Shoes. Every year as school rolls around, my mother and I must go shopping downtown. It's not new supplies or clothing we seek, but a pair of school shoes, long, black, and sleek. They must be quite modern, yet nothing too wild. They should appear sleek and creatively styled. Yet still they must be a comfortable pair and sturdy enough to withstand wear and tear. I tried lots of shoes, but none were quite right, and the one pair I liked was just way too tight. When suddenly there, in front of my eyes, were the perfect shoes in exactly my size. I slipped them on, they fit like a glove. They felt even better, I was in love. I bought the shoes gladly and put them away, hoping to wear for that first special day. At last it's the end of my first day of school. I sit here in pain with my feet on a stool. The shoes that I loved have rubbed me and pinched. My heels have blisters, my toes are all crinched. And now that I ponder the error I made, those cursed black shoes I would willingly trade to restore a semblance of peace to my feet and let them reside in a painless retreat. Thank you very much. Does anyone have questions?
I have a question. In
Sure.
regards to rhythm, I'm writing a poem and I find that the hardest part is the
Mhm.
rhythm. Do you come at a poem with the intention of a certain rhythm, or should you let the words kind of speak to itself for itself and then go back and...
I would think let the words start to find the rhythm themselves, because you still have to, what you want to say is important. And so the topic is going to guide to some extent the rhythm that's going to come along. And you may find that a natural rhythm starts to emerge out of what you want to say if you start to play with rhymes and play with language.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then just to extend that question
Sure.
to another one, I did write this poem and it starts out with like a slower kind of building rhythm, and then
Mhm.
towards the end when the action builds and things are happening, it gets really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So then the comment is the rhythm kind of changes and it's...
And sometimes that's okay. To some extent, it depends a little bit on how easily the transition is made from one set of rhythms to another. If you've set up the because it's about expectations as a reader. You set up that this is what the rhythm is all the way along. So if you're suddenly going to change it, there's got to be a really good reason for it. You might need a pause before it, like a piece of punctuation or a line break, a stanza break might help there before you change it. Or you may need to transition a little bit, like change some of the lines along to reflect that rhythm a little bit more closely. Oftentimes I find in Shel Silverstein's, he'll have a couple of short lines and then he'll have 2 long lines in the middle, and then he'll go back to the rhythm of the first 2 lines. So he does change it, but it's easy to read. You just get carried along by the rhythm. So if someone reading it for you gets carried along by that rhythm, if they can keep up with it, then you're probably on the right track.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Is there any ballpark figures for recommended lengths for poems these days?
Are there any ballpark figures for recommended lengths for poems? Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head, but I would say probably in the less than 14 lines kind of range. It seems like most of what I've seen doesn't seem to be super long. And even poems in, say, like a book like this that are longer are not, like these are some of the longest, which is maybe 20, 25 lines, if that. So probably if you're aiming in that 10 to 14 line range, it's probably about right. And people that are online too, if you have questions, you can interact with Sharon and send them in, if anyone has questions. I'll maybe read one more poem and we'll let people, if there's anyone online who wants to ask a question. This is another one I liked when I was a kid, The Polar Bear in the Frigidaire. I have a page number for it. The Frigidaire, of course, being the brand name of the refrigerator. It's called Bear in There, and that's the picture of it. There's a polar bear in our Frigidaire. He likes it because it's cold in there. With his seat in the meat and his face in the fish and his big hairy paws in the buttery dish. He's nibbling the noodles, he's munching the rice, he's slurping the soda, he's licking the ice. And he lets out a roar if you open the door, and it gives me a scare to know he's in there, the polar bear in our Frigidaire. So that's one where you can see the rhythm alters as you go along, but it's easy to keep up with it. It doesn't throw you off. And I like the speed that you get with his seat in the meat and his face in the fish and his big hairy paws in the buttery dish. You need buttery. You can't say butter dish there, it doesn't work. Dennis Lee has a great poem called The Sitter and the Butter and the Better Batter Fritter. And that's one of those tongue twister examples. And kids love tongue twisters. If you can find a group of words that all work together like that and put them together absurdly, you can have a fantastic poem. Any other questions? Well, I'm very happy to have had this opportunity to do this talk, and I love talking about poetry, and if anyone thinks of other questions afterward, you can reach me by email or through the Guild office, or should I just give my email address?
You can if you want.
It's p.remlinger, R-E-M-L-I-N-G-E-R, @sasktel.net, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much, and thank you Sharon and Canscape and the Saskatchewan Writers Guild as well.
So thank you very much, Paula Jane, for coming. For Saskatchewan.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us your talk. It's very informative and helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.